My name is Sarah Chan. I'm 28 years old, and I used to believe that love was supposed to heal you. That belief died on a Tuesday morning when I found myself staring at my reflection in a hospital bathroom mirror, counting the bruises that had become as familiar as freckles on my skin. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with the same persistence as the lies I'd been telling myself for 3 years. "This is what love looks like," I whispered to the woman in the mirror. But she didn't believe me anymore. It started so differently. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted: confident, charming, successful. He swept into my quiet librarian life like a hurricane of expensive cologne and grand gestures. Roses delivered to my workplace, surprise weekend trips, declarations of love that made my coworkers swoon with envy. I felt chosen, special, like I'd won some cosmic lottery. The red flags looked like rose petals then, scattered along a path. I walked blindly, desperately grateful that someone like him could love someone like me. The first time he raised his voice, I convinced myself it was passion. The first time he grabbed my wrist too tightly, I told myself he was just afraid of losing me. The first time his hand connected with my cheek, I actually apologized to him. That's how insidious it was, the way he rewrote reality until I became complicit in my own destruction. Love shouldn't leave scars, but his did, and I learned to wear long sleeves like armor, makeup like war paint, smiles like shields. But standing in that hospital bathroom, something cracked inside me that wasn't a rib this time. It was the shell I built around my truth. The protective layer of denial that had kept me functioning in a world where love looked like fear and care felt like control. The woman in the mirror looked tired, older than her years, but for the first time in months, her eyes held something that resembled defiance. The doctor had asked the questions they're trained to ask, and I'd given the answers I practiced in my head. Fell down the stairs, walked into a door, slipped in the shower. Each lie felt heavier than the last, but I carried them anyway because the alternative felt impossible. How do you explain that the person who claims to love you most in the world is also the one slowly killing you? How do you admit that you've become a stranger to yourself? I pressed my fingers against the fresh bruise blooming across my collarbone, a purple-black flower that would join the garden of violence growing across my body. Marcus would be gentle tonight, apologetic, full of promises and tears that felt real enough to blur the edges of my anger. He'd bring dinner from my favorite restaurant, flowers to replace the ones that had wilted in the vase he'd thrown at the wall last week. The cycle would begin again, and I'd let it because I didn't know how to break free from something that felt like drowning but called itself love. My phone buzzed against the bathroom counter, his name lighting up the screen like a threat. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages that oscillated between fury and desperation. "Where are you, baby? I'm sorry. Please come home. I can't live without you. I'll change, I promise." The words blurred together into a familiar symphony of manipulation, each note perfectly calibrated to find the cracks in my resolve. I didn't answer the phone. For the first time in 3 years, I let Marcus's calls go to voicemail, let his texts pile up unread like snow against a window. The silence felt dangerous and liberating at once, a rebellion so small it could fit in the palm of my hand, yet somehow large enough to change everything. In that sterile hospital bathroom, I made a choice that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to leave. The realization hit me like cold water, shocking and clarifying. I was going to leave Marcus Chan, the man whose last name I'd taken with such hope, whose ring still circled my finger like a beautiful chain. The thought should have brought fear, but instead, it brought something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but mine to shape, and for a moment I could breathe without permission. Leaving wasn't a decision you made once, I learned. It was a choice you had to make over and over, every time fear whispered that maybe things weren't that bad. Maybe you were overreacting. Maybe this was all you deserved. The bruises would fade, but the doubts were permanent residents in my mind, paying rent in self-worth and confidence I could barely afford to lose. I took a cab to my sister Rachel's apartment across town, my hands shaking as I counted out the fare with bills I'd hidden in my coat pocket over months of secret planning. Rachel opened the door before I could knock, her face already knowing, already breaking. She'd been waiting for this day for 2 years, watching her younger sister disappear piece by piece into a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was rotting from within. We didn't talk at first. She just pulled me inside and helped me. While I fell apart in her hallway, 3 years of suppressed sobs finally finding their voice. The tears felt like they might drown me, but Rachel held me above the surface, her hands steady on my shoulders, her voice whispering the words I'd forgotten how to say to myself. You deserve better. This isn't love. You're going to be okay. Her apartment felt like a sanctuary, small and cluttered with books and plants, and the comfortable chaos of a life lived without fear. I'd forgotten what that looked like, spaces where you could leave things out without worrying they'd become weapons, where raised voices meant laughter instead of terror, where silence was peaceful rather than threatening. Everything felt foreign and wonderful, like learning to see color after years of living in GRAYCCL. Rachel made tea with hands that didn't shake, spoke in a voice that didn't calculate every word for potential consequences. She was everything. I'd been before Marcus confident, spontaneous, unafraid. I studied her like a roadmap back to myself, trying to remember what it felt like to exist without constantly monitoring someone else's mood, without editing my thoughts before they became words. The first night was the hardest. Every car that passed the window might be him. Every phone call could be his voice, angry and persuasive, promising change that never came, but felt possible in the darkness of 3 a.m. when loneliness made even bad love seem better than no love at all. I slept in Rachel's guest room with the door locked, my phone turned off, my wedding ring finally removed and sitting on the nightstand like a discarded lie. Morning came with the strange sensation of waking up without dread for the first time in years. No careful assessment of Marcus's mood. No mental preparation for whatever version of him had emerged overnight. Just sunlight through unfamiliar curtains and the sound of Rachel making coffee in a kitchen where laughter was allowed. I lay there for minutes, letting the peace settle into my bones like medicine, but peace was a luxury I hadn't learned to accept yet. My phone, once I finally turned it on, held a symphony of escalation 63 missed calls. Over 100 text messages that ranged from desperate to furious to manipulative. He'd been to my work, Rachel said, shown up at our parents' house, called every mutual friend we had, painting himself as the worried husband whose unstable wife had disappeared without explanation. This was his specialty. I remembered rewriting the narrative until he became the victim of my unreasonable behavior. By evening, half our friends would believe I'd had some sort of breakdown, that poor Marcus was beside himself with worry. He was probably gathering character witnesses even now, building a case for why I should come home, why I was the problem. That needed fixing. Rachel showed me the messages he'd sent her. Your sister is sick. She needs help. I love her. Why are you keeping us apart? She belongs with me. Each word carefully chosen to sound reasonable while laying the groundwork for the siege he'd mounted around my new freedom. He understood psychology the way predators understand prey instinctively, efficiently. Without conscience, I spent the day oscillating between determination and panic, my resolve ebbing and flowing like tide. One moment I felt strong, clear about my decision to leave, ready to rebuild my life from the ground up. The next, I found myself wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was throwing away something that could be fixed, if I was overreacting. to what might just be a rough patch in an otherwise loving marriage. This was his greatest weapon, the way he'd trained me to doubt my own reality, to question my perceptions until I couldn't trust my own memories. Had things really been that bad? Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe other couples went through similar struggles. Maybe love was supposed to hurt sometimes, and I was just too weak to handle the intensity of real passion. Rachel watched me cycle through these thoughts with the patience of someone who'd seen this battle fought many times in many women. She didn't argue with my doubts or try to convince me with logic. Instead, she showed me pictures of me from 3 years ago, bright-eyed and confident, standing next to recent photos where I looked like a ghost of myself. The evidence was undeniable, written across my face in ways makeup couldn't hide. That evening, she helped me write a list of every incident I could remember, every time his love had left marks on my body or my spirit. The list was longer than I expected, filling 3 pages with moments I'd minimized or forgotten or reframed as something other than what they were. By the time we finished, the paper looked like a coroner's report on the death of the woman I used to be. We talked until dawn about practical things, lawyers and restraining orders and the apartment I'd need to find, the job I'd have to request, a transfer for the new phone number that would mean cutting ties with everyone who might accidentally reveal my location. Leaving Marcus wouldn't be as simple as packing a suitcase. It would require dismantling the entire life we'd built together and constructing something new from whatever pieces of myself I could salvage. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and disappointment, filled with the ghosts of other marriages that hadn't survived contact with reality. Margaret Williams had kind eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses and the sort of competent confidence that came from guiding women through the minefield of leaving dangerous men. She'd heard my story before, she said, in different versions with different details, but always the same. Heartbreaking core. She explained the process with clinical precision, restraining orders and divorce papers. Custody battles that didn't apply to us but felt relevant anyway because Marcus treated me like property he owned rather than a person he'd married. Every legal term felt like building blocks in the wall I was constructing between my old life and whatever came next. Each document another barrier against the man who'd promised to love and protect me but had done neither. The restraining order would be temporary at first, she warned, requiring proof that might be difficult to provide since I'd become so skilled at hiding the evidence of what our marriage really looked like. Photographs of bruises I'd never taken, witnesses to incidents I'd made sure no one ever saw, medical records for injuries I'd explained away with carefully constructed lies. My secrecy, born from shame and fear, had become my enemy, but I had something better than photographs. I realized I had the truth, and the truth had weight even when it couldn't be measured or documented. I had the knowledge of what it felt like to flinch when someone raised their hand, to calculate the emotional temperature of a room before entering it, to live in a constant state of hypervigilance that had worn grooves in my nervous system like water cutting through stone. Margaret asked questions I'd never been asked, listened to answers I'd never been allowed to give. She took notes without judgment, nodded with understanding. And when I finished telling her everything, she looked me in the eyes and said the words that felt like absolution. None of this was your fault. You didn't cause it, you couldn't control it, and you couldn't cure it. You can only save yourself. The first legal document I signed felt like signing my own Emancipation Proclamation, freeing myself from a slavery I'd entered willingly but could no longer endure. My signature looked shaky on the paper, but it was mine, unforced and uncoerced for the first time in years. Margaret smiled as she witnessed it, understanding the magnitude of what had just happened, even if I didn't fully grasp it yet. Walking Out of that office, I felt like I was crossing an invisible border into a country where I might someday be safe again. The restraining order would be served tomorrow, she'd said, and after that, Marcus would be legally required to stay away from me. The piece of paper felt both incredibly powerful and laughably inadequate. How do you stop someone with a document when they'd never been stopped by conscience or compassion? That night at Rachel's, I dreamed about the woman I used to be before I learned that love could be a weapon, before I discovered that the person who promised to protect you could also be the one you needed protection from. She was laughing in the dream, unafraid and unguarded, and when I woke up, I could almost remember what that felt like. The phone rang at 6 a.m. Rachel answered it, her voice sharp with authority I'd forgotten she possessed. "She's not available," she said, and then more firmly, "Don't call here again." The line went dead, but I knew it wouldn't be the end. Marcus had never been good at accepting boundaries, and a legal document wouldn't change the fundamental truth of who he was. The restraining order was served on a Wednesday morning while I was at work, trying to pretend that shelving books and helping patrons find information was still a normal part of a life that felt anything but normal. My supervisor called me into her office with the kind of careful expression that meant she knew more than she was saying. And I realized that Marcus had probably been calling the library, weaving his narrative of the confused wife who needed to come home. Linda had worked at the library for 20 years and had seen enough of life to recognize the signs I thought I'd hidden so well. She sat me down with tea and tissues and told me something I'd never expected to hear from my boss. "Take as much time as you need. Your job will be here when you're ready." The kindness felt foreign and overwhelming, like sunlight after years. In a cave, but Marcus wasn't accepting the restraining order quietly. By afternoon, Rachel was fielding calls from mutual friends who'd been convinced that I was having some sort of breakdown, that poor Marcus was beside himself with worry, that surely this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out if everyone just sat down and talked like adults. The gaslighting had gone public, and I was fighting a war on multiple fronts. Some friends surprised me with their loyalty, immediately cutting ties with Marcus and rallying around me with fierce protectiveness. Others disappointed me with their willingness to believe his version of events, their inability to reconcile the charming man they knew socially with the monster I'd lived with privately. The division was swift and merciless, sorting my social circle into those who would support my freedom and those who would enable my captivity. My parents called that evening, voices tight with confusion and concern. Marcus had reached them first, of course, painting himself as the bewildered husband whose wife had been poisoned against him by her bitter sister. The conversation was heartbreaking in its familiarity, the way they questioned my judgment while expressing love, the way they suggested counseling as if this were a problem that could be solved with better communication rather than complete separation. "Marriage is hard, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice carrying the weight of her own compromises and accommodations. "All couples go through difficult periods. Maybe you just need some time to work things out." I wanted to scream that I'd had 3 years to work things out, that every day had been an attempt to solve a puzzle where I was always the wrong-shaped piece. But instead, I just said I'd think about it and hung up feeling more alone than ever. Rachel found me crying in her kitchen at midnight. Not the cathartic tears of breakthrough, but the bitter ones of recognition. Recognition that healing from this would require not just leaving Marcus, but also rebuilding relationships with people who couldn't understand that. Sometimes love becomes poison, and the only cure is to stop drinking it entirely. She made hot chocolate and sat with me in the darkness. Two sisters trying to navigate the space between the family we'd been born into and the one we'd chosen to create for ourselves. "You're not crazy," she said quietly, "and you're not weak, and you're not wrong. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The words felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in other people's opinions. That night, I wrote letters I would never send to Marcus, explaining why I'd left. To our friends, defending my choices. To my parents, trying to make them understand that their daughter hadn't disappeared, but was finally trying to come back. The act of writing felt like reclaiming my voice, even if the words would remain unread. Friday brought the first violation of the restraining order, as predictable as sunrise. Marcus appeared at the library during my lunch break, not approaching me directly, but standing across the street where I could see him. Could feel his presence like a weight on my chest. He wasn't technically breaking the law, the distance was. Legal, the location was public, but the message was clear. I see you. I'm watching. You can't hide from me. I called Margaret immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. She listened calmly as I described what had happened, then explained what I already knew without direct contact or explicit threats. There wasn't much the police could do. The law, designed to protect people like me, have loopholes that people, like Marcus, understood instinctively. He was playing a game he'd mastered while I was still learning the rules. That weekend, he escalated. Flowers delivered to Rachel's apartment with no card, just the implicit message that he knew where I was staying. My favorite coffee order left on the counter at the cafe where I'd started having breakfast. Paid for but unclaimed, another reminder that he was mapping my new routines, cataloging my movements, preparing for something I couldn't predict but instinctively feared. The psychological warfare was more effective than physical violence had ever been. At least when he hit me, I knew what I was dealing with. This shadow campaign of surveillance and suggestion left me jumping at every unexpected sound, analyzing every stranger's face for signs of familiarity, transforming the simple act of leaving Rachel's apartment into an exercise in hypervigilance that exhausted me before the day began. Rachel wanted to call the police anyway, to create a paper trail that might matter later if things escalated further. But I'd learned not to trust systems that treated stalking like a misdemeanor and domestic violence like a private matter between married people. The restraining order felt increasingly like a suggestion rather than a command, a polite request that Marcus was free to ignore as long as he was clever about it. I started varying my routines, taking different routes to work, shopping at different stores, trying to become unpredictable in a life that had been carefully structured around someone else's need for control. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was still organizing my existence around Marcus, still letting him dictate my choices, just in reverse. Freedom, I was learning, was more complicated than simply leaving. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was the therapist Margaret had recommended, a woman who specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence navigate the complicated aftermath of escape. Her office felt safe in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, tissues placed strategically but not obviously, the kind of space designed for breaking apart and putting yourself back together. Our first session was mostly tears and disjointed explanations. Years of suppressed trauma spilling out in fragments that didn't quite connect into a coherent narrative. She listened without trying to fix or interpret, just holding space for the pieces of my story that I was finally brave enough to speak aloud. By the end of the hour, I felt hollowed out but somehow lighter, like a wound that had finally been cleaned. Healing isn't linear, she told me as I gathered my things to leave. Some days will feel like progress, others like you're moving backward. That's normal. That's expected. The only thing that matters is that you keep moving. I held onto those words like a map through territory I'd never had to navigate before. The nightmares started 3 weeks after I left. Violent dreams where Marcus found me and dragged me back to a house that had become a prison I'd mistaken for a home. I'd wake up gasping, Rachel's guest room feeling both safe and temporary, a way station between the life I'd escaped and whatever came next. Sleep became another casualty of a marriage that had taken so much already, leaving me exhausted and vulnerable when I needed strength. Dr. Mitchell explained that trauma lived in the body as much as the mind, that years of hypervigilance had rewired my nervous system to expect danger even when I was objectively safe. The healing would require retraining responses that had kept me alive in an impossible situation, learning to distinguish between real threats and the phantom, fears that would probably haunt me for years to come. I started looking for my own apartment, something small and secure with multiple locks and windows that didn't face the street. The search felt both practical and symbolic, choosing where to live instead of simply existing where someone else allowed me to be. Every place I looked at, I evaluated through the lens of safety first, comfort second, as if I were seeking shelter from a storm that might never fully pass. The apartment I eventually chose was a third-floor walk-up in a building with good lighting and helpful neighbors, the kind of place where someone screaming would be heard and remembered. It wasn't much. One bedroom, a galley kitchen, windows that faced an alley instead of the street, but it was mine in a way nothing had been for 3 years. The lease I signed was another declaration of independence, my name alone on a document that established my right to exist in space that belonged to me. Moving in was complicated by the reality that most of my possessions were still in the house I'd shared with Marcus, held hostage by a restraining order that prevented me from retrieving them without police escort. The arrangement of that supervised visit felt like planning a military operation timing. Witnesses, backup plans for every scenario we could imagine, and several we hoped we wouldn't need to consider. The police officers who accompanied me were professional but clearly uncomfortable, treating domestic violence calls like family squabbles that required mediation rather than crimes that demanded intervention. They waited in the driveway while I gathered essentials with shaking hands, Rachel beside me for moral support, and Marcus notably absent, probably advised by his lawyer to stay away during the official visit. Walking through rooms where I'd learned to fear my own shadow felt surreal, like touring a museum dedicated to someone else's suffering. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, less significant, as if leaving had somehow diminished the power this place had held over my imagination. The bedroom where I'd lain awake, listening for his footsteps. The kitchen where I'd learned to cook his favorite meals, hoping to forestall his anger. The living room where I'd perfected the art of becoming invisible. They were just rooms now, empty of the terror that had once filled them. I took only what was truly mine: clothes, books, a few photographs from before we'd met. The jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything else felt contaminated by association, infected with memories I wanted to leave behind. The wedding dress hanging in the closet might as well have been a crime scene, beautiful evidence of how thoroughly I'd been deceived by my own desires. The officers rushed me through the process, clearly eager to finish a task they found awkward and unnecessary. 20 minutes to gather the remnants of 3 years, to salvage what I could from the wreckage of a life I'd built with someone who'd systematically demolished my sense of self. As we loaded the boxes into Rachel's car, I felt both liberated and bereft, carrying away pieces of who I'd been while leaving behind any hope of who I'd thought I might become. The first night in my own apartment was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Every sound felt amplified: the building settling, neighbors walking overhead, traffic passing in the alley below. But underneath the fear was something I'd almost forgotten existed. The profound peace of being alone without being lonely, of existing in space where no one was monitoring my breathing or calculating my mood or preparing to punish me for imagined infractions. Walked through the empty rooms like an explorer claiming new territory, touching walls that belonged to me, opening windows I could close whenever I chose. turning lights on and off without considering whether the electricity bill would provoke an argument. The freedom was intoxicating and overwhelming, like learning to use muscles that had been immobilized for years. The divorce papers arrived by registered mail on a Tuesday, thick legal documents that transformed 3 years of marriage into a series of financial calculations and property divisions. Margaret had prepared me for this moment, but seeing our relationship reduced to lists of assets and debts felt both anticlimactic and profound. Love, it turned out, was easier to dissolve than I'd expected, at least on paper. Marcus contested everything, of course, turning what should have been a straightforward process into a war of attrition designed to exhaust my resources and resolve. He challenged my right to alimony, disputed my claims about his income, demanded custody of pets we'd never had and furniture I'd never wanted. Each filing felt like another attempt to control me, to force me back into a dynamic where his desires mattered more than my reality. But I learned something about myself in the weeks. Since leaving, I was stronger than either of us had realized, more resilient than years of systematic diminishment had suggested. Every legal challenge he mounted, I met with evidence and documentation. Every attempt to rewrite our history, I countered with receipts and records. The woman who'd once apologized for her own bruises was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the truth was the most powerful weapon I'd ever possessed. My parents came to visit the new apartment, their faces carefully neutral as they took in the sparse furnishings and multiple locks on the front door. The conversation was stilted, full of things we weren't saying, questions they weren't asking, truths I wasn't sure they were ready to hear. They loved me, I knew that, but their love was complicated by their inability to understand how I'd ended up in a situation they'd never seen coming. He seemed like such a nice young man, my mother said, fingering the curtains I'd hung to block the view from outside. The past tense felt like progress, even if the bewilderment in her voice suggested she still couldn't reconcile the Marcus they'd known socially with the one I'd lived with privately. Abusers, I learned, were experts at compartmentalization, showing different faces to different audiences with the skill of professional actors. My father was quieter, his anger simmering beneath the surface in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Marcus himself. I should have seen the signs, he kept saying, as if my suffering were somehow a reflection of his failure to protect me. I wanted to tell him that the signs had been invisible by design, that Marcus had been too careful to leave evidence that couldn't be explained away, but instead I made tea and changed the subject to safer ground. They left with promises to call more often, and invitations to visit them whenever I needed to get away from the city. The distance between us felt geographic and emotional, a gap created by experiences I couldn't fully explain to people who'd never had to question whether the person who claimed to love them most might also be the most dangerous person in their world. 6 months after leaving, I got a job transfer to a different branch of the library system, a small suburban location where no one knew my story, and I could rebuild my professional identity without the weight of whispered conversations and pitying looks. The head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a woman in her 60s who'd spent her career creating safe spaces for people seeking refuge in books, and she welcomed me with the kind of matter-of-fact kindness that didn't require explanation or gratitude. Work was familiar but felt different in this new context, helping patrons find information, organizing programs for children, maintaining collections that reflected the community's needs and interests. I was good at my job, something I'd forgotten during years of being told I was incompetent at everything that mattered. Each successful interaction with a patron, each program that went well, each problem I solved efficiently reminded me that I'd been capable all along, just convinced otherwise by someone whose greatest skill was making others doubt themselves. The other librarians accepted me without drama or curiosity, treating me like the competent professional I was rather than the victim I'd been. The distinction felt crucial. I was learning that survival was only the first step in a much longer journey toward reclaiming not just my safety, but my sense of self-worth and professional identity. My apartment was slowly becoming a home, furnished with pieces I chose for comfort rather than appearances, decorated with colors I liked instead of ones that matched Marcus's vision of sophistication. The walls were covered with photographs of friends and family, art I'd bought from local artists, prints of places I wanted to travel to when I felt brave enough to venture further from the safety. I constructed one careful decision at a time. Doctor Mitchell and I were working through the complicated process of distinguishing between reasonable caution and trauma-based hypervigilance, learning when my instincts were protecting me from real danger and when they were simply recreating familiar patterns of fear. Some days I felt like I was making real progress. Others, I caught myself scanning every room for exits and assessing every stranger for potential threats. My nervous system still calibrated for a life I no longer lived. The divorce was finally finalized on a gray October morning, the judge's signature transforming me from Marcus's wife back into Sarah Chen, a woman who belonged to herself again. I kept his name during the proceedings to avoid the paperwork complications, but seeing it on the final decree felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. I would change it back, I decided, reclaim the identity I'd surrendered too easily. In the intoxication of being chosen by someone I thought was better than me. Margaret handed me copies of the documents with a smile that held both congratulation and concern. "This is the end of the legal process," she said, "but not necessarily the end of his attempts to maintain control. Stay vigilant, but don't let vigilance become a prison of its own making." The distinction felt important and difficult. How do you stay safe without sacrificing the freedom you've fought so hard to reclaim? That evening, I celebrated with Rachel and a few close friends, women who'd supported me through the worst period of my life and were now witnessing my gradual return to something resembling the person I'd been before I learned that love could be a weapon. We raised glasses of wine and a toast to new beginnings, to second chances, to the possibility that the worst thing that had ever happened to me might not define the rest of my life. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus wasn't finished with me yet, that his silence over the past few months had been strategic rather than accepting. Men like him, I learned, didn't simply move on when they lost control of something they'd considered their possession. They regrouped, planned, waited for the right moment to reassert their dominance in ways that couldn't be predicted or prevented by restraining orders and divorce decrees. The first sign that my peace was temporary came in the form of a new social media account following me online, a profile with no photos but detailed knowledge of my daily routines and recent activities. The messages were subtle at first, comments on posts that only someone watching me closely would understand, likes on photographs that revealed intimate knowledge of my new life. The digital stalking felt both less immediate and more invasive than his physical presence had been. A reminder that technology had made it almost impossible to truly disappear from someone determined to find you. I blocked the account, then another, then several more as they appeared with clockwork regularity. Each new profile felt like a violation, a forced intimacy with someone I legally separated myself from, but couldn't seem to escape completely. The internet, which had initially felt like a space where I could control my own narrative, became another battlefield where he held most of the advantages. Margaret suggested documenting everything: screenshots, timestamps, patterns of behavior that might eventually add up to enough evidence for law enforcement to take seriously. But the bar for proving cyberstalking was high, and the behavior was carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold of prosecutable offense. Marcus had always been intelligent about his cruelty, strategic in ways that made him appear reasonable. To outside observers, while systematically terrorizing his target, work became my sanctuary. The one place where he couldn't follow me without consequences that might actually matter to him professionally. But even there, I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking the locks on doors, varying my schedule in ways that probably seemed paranoid to my colleagues, but felt necessary for my peace of mind. The hypervigilance was exhausting, a constant low-level drain on energy I needed for healing and rebuilding. Dr. Mitchell helped me develop strategies for managing the anxiety without becoming completely isolated, techniques for staying appropriately careful without sacrificing the social connections that were crucial for long-term recovery. The balance felt impossible some days. Too much caution meant missing opportunities for joy and connection. Too little meant potentially walking into dangerous situations. I'd worked so hard to escape. I started taking a self-defense class at the community center, something I'd never imagined needing, but now felt essential for reclaiming a sense of agency over my own physical safety. The instructor, a woman named Kim who'd survived her own abusive relationship, taught us that confidence was often the best deterrent, that predators typically targeted people who seemed vulnerable and isolated rather than those who moved through the world with awareness and purpose. The physical training felt like meditation, focusing my mind on the present moment while building strength I'd never known I possessed. Each technique I learned, each scenario we practiced, added another layer to the armor I was constructing between my past and my future. I would never be helpless again, I promised myself. Even if I couldn't guarantee, I'd never be threatened. Spring arrived with a kind of gentle warmth that made everything seem possible again, and I began to relax into the rhythm of my new life with something approaching genuine contentment. The apartment felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. Work brought satisfaction and social connection, and my relationships with family and friends were slowly healing from the damage inflicted by years of isolation and secrecy. Even started dating again, carefully and cautiously, learning to trust my instincts about people while fighting the urge to see red flags in every gesture of affection or moment of intensity. David was a teacher I'd met through a mutual friend, kind and patient and completely bewildered by my need to move slowly through what should have been simple interactions. But he seemed willing to let me set the pace, to earn trust rather than demand it, and for the first time in years, I began to believe that love might be possible without fear. David and I had been seeing each other for 3 months when Marcus reappeared in my life. This time through a carefully orchestrated encounter at the grocery store where I did my weekly shopping. He appeared in the produce section as if by coincidence, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered, his smile carrying the same mixture of charm and menace that had once made my heart race with excitement and now made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "Sarah," he said, my name and his, voice still capable of triggering every alarm system in my body despite months of healing and therapy. "You look wonderful, Happy." The observation felt like both a compliment and a threat. An acknowledgement that I'd found something he hadn't given me, and a subtle suggestion that he could take it away again. Gripped my shopping cart handle until my knuckles went white, every muscle in my body preparing for fight or flight, while my mind tried to process the reality of his presence and what had become a safe space. He looked thinner than I remembered, his expensive clothes hanging differently on a frame that seemed diminished by whatever consequences his behavior had finally earned him. But his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had once fascinated me and later terrified me. "Marcus," I managed, proud that my voice didn't shake, even though everything inside me was screaming. "You're not supposed to be here." The restraining order was still in effect, technically, though proving violation in a public space would be difficult unless he made explicit threats or refused to leave when asked. He smiled the smile that had once made me feel chosen, special, worthy of attention from someone I'd considered out of my league. Now it looked predatory, practiced, the expression of someone who learned to use charm as camouflage for darker intentions. I'm just shopping. Same as you. Can a man buy groceries without violating some court order? The innocence was performed, calculated to sound reasonable to any potential witnesses while communicating clearly to me that he knew exactly what he was doing. Stay away from me, I said, louder than necessary, hoping to attract attention from other shoppers, to create witnesses who might remember this encounter if it escalated into something the police would finally take seriously. But the grocery store continued its mundane business around us. Other customers focused on their own needs, oblivious to the drama playing out in the produce aisle. He raised his hands in mock surrender, the gesture both theatrical and threatening. I'm not doing anything wrong, Sarah. Just trying to live my life, same as you. But he moved closer as he spoke, violating my personal space in a way that felt aggressive despite appearing casual to outside observers. The scent of his cologne, once intoxicating, now made me nauseous with memory and association. I abandoned my cart and walked quickly toward the exit, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He didn't follow immediately, but I could feel his presence behind me like weight, like gravity, pulling me back toward a dynamic I'd fought so hard to escape. The parking lot felt endless, every car a potential hiding place, every shadow a threat I couldn't evaluate properly through the haze of panic. My hands shook as I unlocked my car, fumbling with keys that suddenly felt foreign and uncooperative. He appeared beside my driver's side window just as I got the door open, close enough to touch, but careful not to make contact that could be interpreted as assault. We should talk, he said, his voice carrying the tone he'd once used to discuss dinner plans or weekend activities, as if terrorizing his ex-wife were simply another item on his social calendar. There's nothing to talk about, I said, sliding into the driver's seat and immediately locking the doors. But he leaned against my car, his body blocking my path out of the parking space, forcing a confrontation I wasn't prepared for and didn't want. The position was strategic, not technically illegal, but effective at trapping me in a situation where I'd have to escalate to escape. Through the car window, Marcus looked almost reasonable, a concerned ex-husband trying to have a civilized conversation with a woman who was clearly overreacting to a chance encounter. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already planning his next move, already anticipating my responses and preparing counters that would leave me feeling crazy and irrational, regardless of what I chose to do. I've been thinking about us, he said, his voice muffled by the glass but still clear enough to understand. About what went wrong, how we could fix things. I've been seeing someone, a therapist, working on my anger issues. I'm different now, Sarah. Better. The words were familiar, variations on promises he'd made dozens of times during our marriage, apologies that had bought him temporary forgiveness but never lasting change. I started the engine, hoping the noise would encourage him to move, but he remained pressed against my car like he had every right to be there. Other shoppers walked past without seeming to notice anything unusual about the scene. Or perhaps they'd learned the same lesson I'd absorbed during my marriage, that domestic disputes were private matters, uncomfortable situations best avoided by people who didn't want to get involved in someone else's drama. I know you're seeing someone, he continued, his tone still conversational but with an edge that made my skin crawl. David, right? The high school teacher? Nice guy. I'm sure. He thinks he knows you, but he doesn't know what you're really like, does he? Doesn't know how you can twist things, make someone look like the bad guy when they're just trying to love you the way you need to be loved. The mention of David's name felt like ice water in my veins, confirmation that Marcus had been watching, gathering information, preparing for this moment when he'd reveal the extent of his surveillance and the vulnerability of the new life I'd built. The threat was implicit but clear. He could reach David, could poison that relationship the same way he poisoned others, could ensure that I remained as isolated and dependent as he needed me to be. I rolled down the window just enough to speak. Clearly, move away from my car, Marcus, now. The command came out stronger than I felt, drawing on reserves of courage I'd been building through months of therapy and self-defense classes and the slow, painful process of remembering that I had rights that didn't require his permission or approval. He smiled at my tone, the expression equal parts amused and threatening. Or what? You'll call the police? We both know how that went last time. He was right. Of course, the previous encounters had resulted in reports that went nowhere, documentation that proved nothing, a system that seemed designed to protect men like him rather than women like me. But something had changed in me during the months since our divorce, something that made his confidence feel less inevitable and more like a miscalculation on his part. I wasn't the same woman who'd apologized for her own bruises, who'd made excuses for his behavior, who'd believed that love was supposed to hurt and that pain was the price of being chosen by someone like him. I put the car in reverse and began backing up slowly, forcing him to choose between moving or being struck by my bumper. For a moment, I thought he might hold his ground, might force me to choose between escape and assault charges, but at the last second, he stepped aside with a laugh that felt like fingernails on chalkboard. "This isn't over, Sarah," he called as I drove away, the words carrying across the parking lot like a promise and a threat. Wrapped in the same breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer as I drove to the nearest police station. Muscle memory carrying me through turns and traffic lights while my mind reeled from the encounter. The officer who took my statement was professional but clearly skeptical, taking notes with a resigned expression of someone who'd heard similar stories countless times and knew how rarely they resulted in meaningful consequences. The police report generated a case number and a promise to look into it, but I'd learned not to expect much from a system that treated stalking like a misdemeanor and emotional terrorism like a civil matter between ex-spouses. The officer suggested I avoid places where he might show up, as if reorganizing my entire life around his potential presence were a reasonable solution rather than another form of the captivity I'd worked so hard to escape. I called Dr. Mitchell from the police station parking lot, my voice breaking as I tried to explain how a simple grocery run had transformed into evidence that my freedom was more fragile than I'd allowed myself to believe. She listened without judgment, her calm professionalism helping to ground me in the present moment rather than the spiral of worst-case scenarios my mind wanted to explore. "You handled that well," she said when I finished recounting the encounter. "You didn't engage, you documented, you removed yourself from the situation. Those are all healthy responses from someone who's learned to trust her instincts and prioritize her safety." The validation felt important, a counterweight to the internal voice that wondered if I was overreacting. If Marcus really was just trying to have a conversation, if maybe I was the unreasonable one after all. That evening, I had to tell David about Marcus, about the marriage I'd barely mentioned and the divorce I'd described in vague terms as an amicable separation from someone I'd simply grown apart from. The truth felt heavier in the telling, more complicated than the sanitized version I'd offered when we'd first started dating. David listened without interruption, his face cycling through expressions of concern, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked when I finished, and I could hear the hurt underneath the question, the realization that our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of selective disclosure and careful omissions. I wanted to explain that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, that revealing the full truth meant risking judgment or abandonment from someone I was just learning to care about. But the words felt inadequate to bridge the gap between his experience and mine. I didn't want to be defined by it, I said finally. I didn't want to be the damaged woman with the crazy ex-husband. I wanted to be just Sarah, someone worth knowing for who I am now, not what I survived. The explanation felt both true and insufficient, honest, but incomplete. The kind of half-truth that had become my default mode of self-protection. David was quiet for a long time, processing information that changed not just his understanding of my past, but his assessment of his own safety in the present. Dating a stalker's ex-wife wasn't something he'd signed up for when he'd asked me to coffee 6 months ago, and I couldn't blame him. If he decided the complications weren't worth whatever he'd found attractive about me in the first place, what do we do now? He asked eventually, the we in his question feeling like a small miracle, evidence that he wasn't planning to run from complications he hadn't created and couldn't control. The relief was overwhelming, bringing tears I'd been holding back since the encounter in the parking lot. Gratitude for a man who was choosing to stand with me rather than protecting himself by walking away. We talked until dawn about practical things, security measures and communication, protocols, and the ways our relationship would need to change to accommodate the reality that Marcus was an active threat rather than a closed chapter from my past. David suggested I stay at his place for a while, at least until we could assess whether Marcus's reappearance was an isolated incident or the beginning of a new campaign of harassment. The offer felt both generous and terrifying, a level of intimacy and dependence I wasn't sure I was ready for, but might not have the luxury of avoiding. Moving in with David, even temporarily, meant accelerating our relationship timeline and potentially putting him at risk. But it also meant not facing this threat alone, not having to rebuild my security from scratch while trying to maintain the illusion of normal life. David's house felt like a fortress compared to my apartment, with solid doors and a security system and neighbors who knew each other well enough to notice strangers lingering where they didn't belong. But even in this safer environment, I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking locks obsessively, positioning myself where I could see all entrances to whatever room I occupied. The hypervigilance was back in full force, undoing months of progress in a single afternoon dot. We developed routines that felt both protective and suffocating. David driving me to work and picking me up. Coordinated schedules that ensured I was never alone in public. Code words for situations where I felt unsafe but couldn't speak freely. The measures were probably necessary, but they also meant that Marcus was controlling my life again, just indirectly, through the fear he'd reintroduced into my carefully constructed sense of security. The cyberstalking intensified after our grocery store encounter, new profiles appearing daily across multiple platforms, messages that referenced details from our parking lot conversation, photos of David's house taken from angles that suggested Marcus had been watching for weeks before making his physical presence known. Each notification felt like a violation, proof that privacy was an illusion and safety was temporary at best. Margaret filed for a strengthened restraining order. But the process would take weeks, and in the meantime, Marcus was free to continue his campaign of psychological warfare as long as he stayed technically within legal boundaries. The system, designed to protect people like me, moved too slowly to address threats that evolved daily, adapting to legal constraints like a virus, learning to resist antibiotics. I started having panic attacks again, my body remembering trauma patterns I thought were healed, responding to present threats with reactions calibrated for past dangers. Dr. Mitchell increased our session frequency, helping me distinguish between reasonable precautions and trauma responses. But the line between appropriate fear and debilitating anxiety became increasingly difficult to navigate. Work suffered as my concentration fragmented between job responsibilities and constant threat assessment, my performance declining in ways that felt both inevitable and unfair. Mrs. Patterson noticed, but didn't comment directly, instead offering flexible scheduling and the kind of support that didn't require explanation or justification. The kindness felt precious, a reminder that not everyone in my life was a potential threat. David struggled too, caught between wanting to protect me and recognizing that overprotection could become another form of control, that his good intentions might accidentally recreate dynamics I'd worked so hard to escape. We had conversations about boundaries and independence that felt mature and healthy, but also highlighted how complicated relationships became when stalking was part of the equation. "I don't want to become him," David said one evening after I'd flinched away from his touch, my nervous system unable to distinguish between comfort and threat in moments of high stress. The fear in his voice was real, the recognition that love could accidentally become possessive, that protection could transform into restriction if we weren't careful about maintaining my autonomy within our security measures. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the library system had a program for employees experiencing domestic violence, resources I'd never known existed that might provide support beyond what traditional legal channels offered. The coordinator, a woman named Lisa who'd survived similar circumstances, understood the complexities in ways that well-meaning friends and family couldn't quite grasp. "Stalkers count on isolation," she explained during our first meeting. "They want you to feel like you're facing this alone, like accepting help means admitting weakness. But community is your greatest weapon against someone who's trying to convince you that you're powerless." The words felt like permission to stop pretending. I could handle everything independently, to accept support without seeing it as failure. Lisa connected me with a network of resources I'd never imagined existed: support groups for stalking survivors, legal advocates who specialized in cases the regular system couldn't handle effectively, technology experts who could help document cyber harassment in ways that might actually hold up in court. For the first time since Marcus had reappeared, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone against someone who had all the advantages. The support group met weekly in a community center conference room, 8 women of various ages and backgrounds, united by the common experience of being hunted by men who claimed to love them. Their stories were different in detail, but similar in structure: the gradual escalation, the legal system's inadequacy, the way stalking transformed everyday activities into calculated risks that required constant vigilance and strategic planning. Maria had been stalked by her ex-boyfriend for 2 years before he finally violated his restraining order in a way that resulted in jail time. Jennifer's ex-husband had hired private investigators to follow her and gather information about her new life, staying just within legal boundaries while making it clear that privacy was an illusion. Sandra's stalker had been a casual date who had become obsessed after she politely declined a second meeting, proving that even minimal romantic involvement could trigger dangerous fixation. Listening to their experiences, I realized that my situation wasn't unique or unusually dangerous. It was depressingly common, part of a pattern of male entitlement and female vulnerability that the legal system was ill-equipped to address effectively. The recognition was both comforting and terrifying, evidence that I wasn't alone, but also that the problem was much larger than any individual solution could address. The group taught practical strategies I'd never considered how to document, evidence in ways that would be useful in court, which apps could track location data without leaving digital footprints, how to communicate with family and friends about safety concerns without becoming socially isolated. But more importantly, they provided emotional support from people who understood viscerally what it meant to live under constant threat from someone who'd once claimed to care about your well-being. Through the group, I learned about a private security consultant named James who specialized in stalking cases, someone who understood the psychology of obsessive pursuers and could develop personalized safety plans that went beyond standard police recommendations. His services weren't cheap, but Lisa helped me apply for grants from organizations that funded safety measures for domestic violence survivors. James's assessment of my situation was thorough and sobering. Marcus displayed classic patterns of escalating control, and his reemergence after months of parent acceptance suggested a level of persistence that would probably require more than legal deterrence to resolve. He recommended security upgrades for both my apartment and David's house, changes to my digital footprint, and protocols for documenting every contact attempt in ways that might eventually build a prosecutable case. The goal isn't to make you invisible, he explained, but to make stalking you more trouble than it's worth while gathering evidence that could support stronger legal action. If he escalates further, the strategy felt both practical and depressing. A long-term campaign against someone whose primary weapon was his willingness to invest unlimited time and energy in making my life miserable. The security measures helped restore some sense of control, but they also served as daily reminders that my freedom was conditional, that safety required constant vigilance and strategic thinking rather than the casual assumption that I had the right to exist without fear. The new normal was exhausting, a hyper-aware state that left little energy for the joy and spontaneity that made life worth living. But within the constraints imposed by Marcus's presence, David and I found ways to create moments of genuine happiness cooking. Dinner together while security cameras monitored the perimeter, taking walks in well-lit public spaces where we could hold hands without worrying about being followed, having conversations about future plans that acknowledged current limitations while refusing to be completely defined by them. 6 months after Marcus's reappearance, something unexpected happened. He made a mistake. The private investigator he'd hired to photograph me leaving David's house was arrested for trespassing on school property while trying to gather information about David's work schedule. The arrest created a paper trail that connected back to Marcus, finally providing the evidence needed for law enforcement to take my complaint seriously. The detective assigned to the case, Sarah Rodriguez, had specialized training in stalking investigations and understood the complexities that had confused earlier officers. She looked at the accumulated evidence, the social media harassment, the grocery store encounter, the hired surveillance, the restraining order violations, and saw a pattern that merited serious criminal charges rather than civil remedies. Marcus was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his office, the public nature of his detention finally providing consequences that might actually matter to someone who'd built his identity around professional success and social respectability. The charges included stalking, harassment, and violation of a protective order, felonies that carried real prison time rather than the slap-on-the-wrist sentences. Typical for domestic violence cases, the relief was overwhelming and complicated. Victory mixed with the recognition that legal consequences didn't necessarily eliminate danger, that men facing imprisonment for stalking sometimes escalated to more serious crimes rather than accepting defeat. Detective Rodriguez warned me to remain vigilant until after the trial, to treat his arrest as a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution. But for the first time in months, I could walk to my car without scanning the parking lot for familiar faces, could check my email without bracing for messages from fake accounts, could make plans with David without calculating security implications for every activity. The freedom felt fragile but real, a reminder of what normal life was supposed to feel like when you weren't living under siege. The trial was scheduled for spring, giving me months to prepare testimony about years of abuse that I'd never spoken about publicly, experiences I've minimized and normalized and sometimes forgotten entirely until forced to confront them in the harsh light of legal scrutiny. The process would be re-traumatizing, Margaret warned, but it might also be healing. A chance to finally tell the complete truth about what had happened during those 3 years of marriage. Dr. Mitchell helped me prepare for the emotional challenges of testifying, teaching me techniques for staying grounded while recounting traumatic memories, ways to maintain my sense of self while submitting to cross-examination, designed to discredit my credibility and minimize Marcus's responsibility. The preparation felt like training for war, which, in many ways, it was. David asked me to marry him on a December evening when snow was falling outside his living room window, the proposal coming not with grand gestures or public declarations, but with quiet certainty and the kind of love that felt like coming home after years of being lost. I said yes through tears that were equal parts joy and terror. Happiness at being chosen by someone who actually saw me mixed with fear that I might not know how to be married to someone who wasn't trying to destroy me. We're planning a small ceremony for next fall, after the trial, when I'll know whether Marcus is in prison or still free to haunt the edges of whatever life I try to build. The wedding will be simple, focused on commitment rather than performance, surrounded by people who've supported me through the worst period of my life and want to celebrate whatever comes next. I'm 30 now, older and hopefully wiser than the woman who once believed that love was supposed to hurt, that jealousy was romantic, that a man's need to control every aspect of your existence was evidence of how much he cared. The scars are still there, visible and invisible, reminders of a time when I forgot that I deserve kindness and respect and the basic human right to exist without fear. Love shouldn't leave scars, but Marcus is dead, and I'm still learning to see them not as evidence of my failure, but as proof of my survival, maps of a journey through darkness that led me back to light. The woman I am now wouldn't recognize the woman I was then, wouldn't understand how I could have mistaken cruelty for passion, control for care, possession for love, but I understand her now, that frightened woman who apologized for her own bruises and believed she deserved whatever treatment she received. I understand her and I forgive her, and sometimes in quiet moments, I thank her for finding the strength to leave, for choosing survival over familiarity, for believing that somewhere beyond the reach of the man who claimed to own her was a life worth fighting for. The future stretches ahead, uncertain but mine to shape, full of possibilities I'm still learning to imagine. And for the first time in years, when I look in mirrors, the woman looking back at me is someone I recognize. Someone I like, someone who knows the difference between love and violence and will never ever confuse the two again.